In the glittering halls of Newport's high society, every glance hides ambition, and every promise conceals a price. When young Martha Wentworth's father offers her hand to a powerful banker twice her age, she believes she's sacrificing her freedom to save her family's name. But on the day of the wedding, a whispered secret changes everything, unveiling betrayal, vengeance, and a love that defies every rule. What begins as a union of duty soon becomes a battle between pride and redemption, where hearts are tested and nothing is as it seems. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe love can survive a marriage built on lies? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1891. The heavy drapes of the once glorious Wentworth mansion muffled the cries of the seagulls beyond the cliffs, and the salt breeze that dared to creep in through the half-opened window was no longer welcome in a home clinging to its fading pride. Dust clung to the carved mahogany panels of the drawing room, and the fireplace, cold even in summer, stood like a monument to better times. Martha Wentworth, seated with her back perfectly straight on the worn velvet settee, folded her gloved hands over her lap with the same quiet dignity that had been demanded of her since childhood. Her gown, a pale blue silk with ivory lace trim, once custom-made in Paris, had been altered too many times to hide its age. Yet on her, it still spoke of refinement, of restraint, of sacrifice. Across from her, pacing with a mix of irritation and desperation, stood Albert Wentworth, her father. Once hailed as one of Newport's boldest shipping merchants, he now bore the weary look of a man who had gambled with pride and lost. His frock coat hung too loosely on his frame, his collar was stiff but slightly yellowed at the edge, and in his eyes burned the final flickers of entitlement. "You will do it, Martha," he said, turning to her sharply, as though she had already objected. "It is not a matter of romance, nor of comfort. It is survival." Martha did not flinch. She had long grown used to her father's theatrical speeches, but this time there was something colder in his tone, more final. "Mr. Lowell," she replied slowly, tasting the name with the formality of a contract, "is a man of substantial means." Albert exhaled through his nose, avoiding her eyes. "He is a tycoon, respected across the eastern seaboard, and a widower, dignified, generous, capable of restoring what I, have allowed to crumble." Martha lowered her gaze to the floor, where a faded Aubusson rug spread beneath her slippers like the last remains of a forgotten ballroom. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "He is also 55 years old, and you are 27, her father snapped, though not unkindly. "Not 17. Do you suppose there are suitors queuing at our door? You've had chances, Martha. You turned them all away." "Because none of them saw me," she thought. "Not truly." But she said nothing. Albert stepped closer, lowering his voice with something that might have resembled tenderness if it were not so self-serving. He offered to settle the debts, the estate, even the staff's wages. No one else would show such generosity. He could have chosen a girl half your age, but he chose you. Martha raised her eyes to her father's, and for the first time that afternoon, he faltered. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only a quiet resignation that cut deeper than protest ever could. "And what do I offer him in return, Papa?" she asked. "Besides your unpaid accounts and the last name that no longer buys entry into any drawing room in Newport?" Albert turned away. "Your virtue. Your manners, your name still carries weight, less than it once did, but enough. And your silence." At that, something inside her stirred, but she swallowed it down. The silence her father referred to was not a passing thing. It was a currency she had long learned to trade. The silence of decorum, of grief, of long afternoons where longing had no name and even less purpose. That evening the engagement was announced in the Newport Chronicle. In a discreet column, buried beneath accounts of regattas and charity galas, a small paragraph noted, "A forthcoming union between Miss Martha Wentworth, daughter of the esteemed Mr. Albert Wentworth and Mr. Edwin Lowell, renowned banking gentlemen of considerable fortune, is expected to unite two venerable families. The ceremony is to be held next month at St. Mary's Church. The following morning, the whispers began. She's marrying him for his money, or he for her name. Is she desperate, or just dutiful? A respectable match, yes, but rather odd, isn't it? Martha heard none of it firsthand, but the glances at the grocers, the stiff nods at the dressmakers, and the careful avoidance of her name in parlours told her everything. In her room, by the glow of a single oil lamp, she unfolded the letter Edwin Lowell had sent. No declarations, no poetry, only a concise expression of intent penned in a precise hand. Miss Wentworth, I hope this arrangement brings you peace, as it brings me clarity. I shall endeavour to honour the commitment with respect and provision. Yours faithfully, E. Lowell. No affection, no promises, just clarity. She folded the letter, pressed it between the pages of her prayer book, and looked at herself in the mirror. Not the pale silk gown, not the dark eyes that mirrored her mother's, but the woman behind them. And she whispered, as though to a stranger, "Let them say what they will. Let them believe I am purchased, but I will walk into that church with my head high. If I am to be his bride, let me be no one's fool." Outside, the wind picked up along the cliffs, rattling the shutters, and within the great house of fading chandeliers and cracked marble, Martha Wentworth, daughter of a forgotten empire, prepared to trade her name for survival, and step into the arms of a man she had never once seen. The bells of St. Mary's Church rang out over the quiet splendour of Newport, echoing through the cobbled streets like a solemn decree. Their chimes cut through the morning haze with regal precision, calling forth the city's finest to witness what the papers called a union of legacy and fortune. Yet beneath the ceremonial grandeur, something unspoken threaded itself into every breath Martha took, something colder than nerves and heavier than silk. Within the nave of the church, sunlight streamed through stained glass in slanted beams of colour, painting the white and gold interior with fleeting patches of violet, amber, and rose. The air smelled of incense and polished wood, and the hum of quiet anticipation swelled beneath the soaring arches. Women in hats, feathered and jewelled, whispered behind fans. Men with silver cufflinks stood stiff in tailored coats. It was an assembly of faces Martha had known all her life, some friendly, others false, most curious. At the foot of the altar stood Edwin Lowell, solemn as a statue in his perfectly tailored frock coat of midnight black wool, his waistcoat embroidered with understated silver thread, his gloved hands folded neatly before him. The tycoon did not glance back as she entered. He waited, composed, unmoving, as though the ceremony were a formality long decided. His greying temples and rigid posture gave him an air of both command and detachment. To the gathered crowd, he was a man of influence securing what remained of legacy. To Martha, he was still a stranger. Outside the grand oak doors, a white carriage pulled by matched greys had brought her from the Wentworth mansion under a sky so blue it mocked her turmoil. She had stepped down in silence, veiled in layers of ivory satin, her train carried by a maid in pale lavender gloves. Her gown shimmered subtly with each movement, embroidered in silver thread along the bodice and hem, with tiny blossoms that caught the light. Around her throat, a simple sapphire pendant gleamed, her only adornment aside from a pair of pearl earrings that had once belonged to her mother. Her face was hidden beneath a fine lace veil, and she welcomed it. The veil was not a romantic gesture, but a shield. As the organ swelled and the congregation rose, Martha walked slowly down the aisle. Each step landed like a quiet verdict, her gloved fingers barely brushing the silk of her bouquet, white roses and trailing greenery bound with a satin ribbon. The hush in the church was deafening. From the pews came no audible murmur, Yet Martha could feel the weight of 100 gazes measuring her, dissecting the angle of her chin, the fall of her gown, the distance between her and the man who would in minutes become her husband. Her father stood beside her for only a moment before stepping back without a word, his face unreadable. And then she stood before Edwin, close enough to see the steel in his eyes, close enough to sense something else, an unease perhaps. But he gave her no greeting. The priest opened his book, voice deep and steady, and began the ritual. But before the vow was spoken, Edwin leaned forward, barely audible, so low that only she could hear it. His voice brushed her ear like the wind before a storm. "Your father once betrayed me, Miss Wentworth. This is his penance." The words struck not like a shout, but like a whisper meant to fracture. She froze, her heartbeat turning brittle. Her gaze did not flinch, but something inside her shifted. She looked up into his eyes, searching for cruelty, and found only calculation, or perhaps regret. It was too brief to name. The priest's voice droned on, reciting blessings that fell hollow on her ears. Martha stood, statue still, as the liturgy flowed past her in waves of ritual. Edwin offered his responses in calm, even tones, his face unreadable. When the moment came for her to speak, her lips parted with difficulty. "I do." 2 words that tasted like stone. 2 words that changed everything. The kiss was not demanded, and Edwin did not insist. He took her hand, gloved and trembling, and placed it gently beneath his arm. The audience rose again, clapping softly, murmuring phrases of approval. One society matron whispered too loudly, "Dignified. Just as it should be, just as it should be." The drive to Lowell Manor was lined with autumn trees beginning to blush at the edges. The journey took less than 15 minutes, but in the quiet of the carriage, it felt like an hour. Neither of them spoke. Martha kept her gaze fixed on the window, on the movement of trees and stone walls, and glimpses of the ocean far below. She dared not ask him what he meant. She dared not show him how deeply his words had shaken her. The carriage passed through wrought iron gates and climbed the winding path toward the estate that now bore her name. Lowell Manor, perched high above the cliffs, loomed like a cathedral carved of pale granite, its turrets rising with restrained majesty. The structure was not ostentatious, but it radiated old money and new power. Wide verandas wrapped the southern wing, and tall windows reflected the sea like mirrors of silence. Servants waited in a formal line outside the main entrance. At the top of the stairs, a maid stepped forward to open the carriage door. Edwin descended first, then turned to offer her his hand. His touch was light, his grip controlled. Not warm, not cold. Martha stepped down slowly, gathering the hem of her gown as she moved. She could feel her pulse in her throat. The butler greeted them with a deep bow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lowell." The words made her skin tighten. Inside, the entrance hall was vast and shadowed, its floor an expanse of black and white marble. A grand staircase curved upward beneath a gilded chandelier that sparkled faintly in the dim light of approaching dusk. Portraits lined the walls. Men and women long gone, gazing down with expressions carved in oil and time. "This way," Edwin said, leading her into a smaller parlour off the main corridor. "The drawing room is being prepared. I thought you might wish to rest before supper. Your maid will assist you." His voice had shifted, polite, distant, almost gentle, as if the words he had spoken at the altar had never passed his lips. Martha nodded once. "Thank you." She did not meet his eyes. She could not. As he turned to go, she finally dared to speak. "Why did you say it, Mr. Lowell?" He stopped, his back still to her. For a moment she thought he might pretend not to have heard. But then, without turning, he answered quietly, "Because I wanted you to know that your father did not offer you freely, and that I did not accept you lightly." And with that, he left her alone, standing in a room that was hers by name, but not yet by truth. A bride, a wife, a possession, yes, but a woman who now carried the weight of a secret no one else in that grand ceremony had heard. She walked to the window, drawing the lace curtain aside. The sea stretched beyond the cliffs, endless and unyielding, its surface glinting with the last light of day. Somewhere out there was the life she had once imagined for herself, but here, in this house of stone and echoes, began the life she had been given, and the whisper she could not forget. The days at Lowell Manor unfolded like a series of muted paintings, rich in frame but void of movement. The walls bore the weight of history, portraits with solemn eyes, oil lamps that flickered in still air, carpets worn where footsteps once marked a life more vivid. Martha moved through the corridors like a carefully placed ornament, her figure always composed, her steps measured, her silence polished to perfection. Outside, the cliff walk shimmered beneath a veil of ocean mist. The waves roared far below the stone terraces, and gulls circled over the jagged rocks with indifferent cries. But within the manor, the world was hushed, preserved like glass behind velvet drapes. No children's laughter, no music, no warmth of hearth or conversation. Only the whisper of her skirts as she passed from one chamber to another, followed discreetly by maids who bowed but never smiled. She had arrived as Mrs. Edwin Lowell, but no one called her that aloud. In the mornings, Martha took her tea alone in the blue drawing room, a space adorned with carved mouldings and sea-toned tapestries that dulled in the pale light. The china was exquisite, porcelain trimmed with gold leaf, but the tea always cooled before she drank it. She would sit by the window, looking out toward the sea, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the teacup while her thoughts wandered far beyond the cliffs. Edwin, ever punctual, dined with her in the evenings but never joined her for breakfast. At supper he would offer polite conversation, usually about estate matters, recent publications in the Atlantic Monthly, or the weather in Boston. His tone was even, his gaze steady, but nothing in his manner invited intimacy. He did not question her moods, nor share his own. He was a man of structure and solemnity, more ghost than husband. "Did you sleep well, Martha?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above the crackle of the fireplace. "I did," she lied, folding her hands over her lap. The silence returned, like a butler well-trained. On her third afternoon in the manor, Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 years with iron-grey hair and a gaze too kind for her station, approached Martha discreetly in the east corridor. "Madam," she said softly, "should you wish to explore the family library, the key is kept beneath the third book in the right cabinet of the study. Mr. Lowell rarely enters that room anymore." Martha blinked. "And why is that, Mrs. Hale?" The woman hesitated. Some doors remain closed out of reverence, others out of grief. She did not ask further, but the next morning, after her solitary breakfast and a walk in the gardens, where even the roses seemed subdued, Martha made her way to the study. The key was exactly where the housekeeper said. The library was a long, shadowed chamber on the second floor, with high ceilings and windows that faced the sea. Shelves soared from floor to crown moulding, stacked with volumes whose spines gleamed like relics. Histories, journals, classical poetry, medical texts, and dusty ledgers. It smelled of vellum and varnish, and when she opened the tall windows, the ocean breeze stirred the curtains like a sigh. She began to read. Hours turned into days. Books led to letters, letters led to fragments. Tucked within a volume of Milton's Paradise Lost, she found a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed to Mrs. C. Lowell. The handwriting was careful but strained. The envelope had never been opened. She stared at it, heart thudding, but did not pry it open. Instead, she traced the name with her fingertip. Clara. That was her name. The first wife. A portrait hung at the end of the library, one Martha had passed before but never examined closely. Now she approached it as though walking into memory. Clara Lowell had been beautiful, in a way that spoke not of vanity, but of radiance. Her features were soft, her eyes full of light, her mouth poised in a near smile that seemed on the verge of laughter. She wore a gown of pale lilac, her hands folded gently over a leather-bound book. Behind her, The artist had painted a blooming rose garden, and in that moment, Martha understood the silence of Lowell Manor. It was not apathy, it was grief turned to architecture. Later that evening at supper, she watched Edwin more closely. His movements were precise, his posture rigid, but there was a distant sadness in the way he looked at the empty space across the table, perhaps forgetting for a second that it was no longer empty. "Do you still use the rose garden?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet. He paused, the knife in his hand hovering over roasted lamb. "No," he said after a beat. "It was my wife's." He did not elaborate, but the shadow that fell over his face lingered through the meal. The next morning, Martha rose before the servants and made her way outside. The rose garden, nestled behind the south wing, was wild now, its hedges overgrown, its paths swallowed by grass. But there, amid the tangled thorns and fallen petals, she saw the bones of something once tended with love. An iron bench, rusted but elegant, sat beneath a crumbling arbor, vines coiled along broken trellises. She knelt beside a withered bush and touched the base of its trunk. Still alive, still waiting. She returned every day after that, in secret. With gloves and shears, she clipped away the decay. She carried buckets of water with her own hands. She whispered to the roses. She did not know why. Perhaps it was the only place in the manor that did not expect her to smile, to speak, or to pretend. The servants began to notice. Maids curtsied more softly, the butler bowed with more depth, and Mrs. Hale, in passing, left a box of fresh gloves by her door, with a note that read simply, "For the roses." But even as the garden began to breathe again, Martha could feel the weight of something unnamed pressing on her. In the gallery, there was a locked door at the end of the corridor, a door no one spoke of. And yet, every time she passed, she felt its silence like a pull. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped from her chambers into the hall. The lamps flickered gently, their glow stretching shadows along the panelled walls. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet. She stood before the door. She placed her hand on the handle. It did not open. A cough echoed faintly down the corridor, not loud, just enough to remind her she was not alone. She turned and found Edwin standing near the staircase, dressed in his house robe and holding a glass of brandy. He said nothing, only looked at her. Martha's breath caught, but she did not retreat. He walked toward her slowly, then stopped beside the locked door. He did not touch it. "That room is not yours," he said quietly. His voice was not cruel. It was tired. Martha nodded. "I know." He looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time. "You're not what I expected," he murmured. "And I do not yet know what that means." Then he turned and walked away. She stood there long after his steps faded. The house did not welcome her, but it did not reject her either. It watched her, and she, like the roses, waited for light, for warmth, for something that might yet bloom beneath the silence. The wind carried the scent of rain long before the clouds reached Lowell Manor. Along the cliffs, the sea churned in restless shades of pewter, and the roses Martha had so carefully coaxed back to life bent under the approaching storm. Each petal quivered with the tremor of something inevitable. The garden, once her refuge, now seemed a stage upon which an unseen drama waited to begin. That morning, she had ventured into one of the lesser-known rooms on the upper floor, a small parlour near the east wing, lined with forgotten portraits. The air was thick with dust and silence, and the curtains hung heavy with disuse. She moved carefully, tracing her fingers along the gilt frames, brushing away time's grey film to reveal faces that watched her with painted solemnity. One portrait drew her in immediately. The woman's expression was serene, almost luminous. Her eyes, soft brown and filled with life, seemed to meet Martha's own with a familiarity that startled her. Clara Lowell. The plaque beneath it read, "Painted in 1868. The late Mrs. Lowell, captured in her youth, dressed in lilac silk and holding a single rose against her heart." Martha stood frozen before the image. There was no mistaking the love that had guided the artist's hand. Every line, every hue, spoke of devotion. She could almost feel Edwin's grief in the lingering strokes, as if he had preserved his wife not in memory, but in colour and canvas. Behind the portrait, a small wooden chest rested beneath a sheet. Curiosity overcame caution. She lifted the cloth and opened the chest, finding an assortment of objects: old ribbons, a silver hair comb, a dried sprig of lavender, and a small bundle of letters tied with faded blue silk. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine. She hesitated, then gently unfolded the first. "My dearest Edwin," it began, "I dreamed of the sea again last night. It was calm, as it never is here, and you were there beside me. If heaven has a sound, I believe it is your voice calling my name." Martha lowered the letter, feeling a pang so unexpected that she had to close her eyes. Clara's presence filled the room, gentle, graceful, haunting. By the time she returned the letters to their place, dusk had settled, and the first drops of rain tapped against the window panes. She covered the chest once more and turned to leave. At the doorway she paused. "Forgive me," she whispered to the empty room, though she wasn't certain whose forgiveness she sought. That night, the storm arrived in earnest. Thunder rolled across the ocean, and lightning illuminated the cliffs like flashes of anger from the heavens. The lamps flickered inside the manor, casting moving shadows upon the walls. Servants hurried to secure the shutters, while Martha, restless, walked toward the grand staircase, drawn by an unease she could not name. It was then she heard it, the low, deliberate sound of the front doors opening against the wind. A figure stood framed in the entrance, rain streaming from his coat, his hair soaked, his jaw set in defiance. He carried the storm with him, and the air seemed to shift at his arrival. Nathaniel Lowell had returned. He was taller than she had imagined, from the few lines she'd read about him in the papers that Edwin occasionally left unattended. His resemblance to his father was subtle, perhaps in the eyes, though his were brighter, sharper, alive with something unrestrained. He looked to be in his early 30s, yet there was a gravity in his expression that spoke of disappointments older than his years. Mrs. Hale appeared from the corridor, startled. "Mr. Nathaniel, we did not expect—" "I know," he interrupted, shrugging off his wet coat. His voice was deep, resonant, edged with cold irony. "My father seldom expects what he cannot control." Martha, standing halfway down the stairs, felt his gaze catch hers for the first time. For a moment the air thickened between them. He looked at her with clear astonishment, though not admiration, something colder, as if he had seen a ghost. "So," he said, after a long silence, his tone sharp, almost mocking, "this is how he honors her memory." Martha did not answer. She stepped forward, one hand resting on the polished banister, her composure unbroken. "You must be Mr. Lowell's son." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "And you must be his new wife." Her heart trembled, though her face remained serene. "I am." He studied her openly, with a scrutiny that might have unsettled another woman. "You're younger than I expected, but not too young. My father always preferred things that reflected restraint rather than passion." Martha inhaled slowly. "Perhaps he has learned that passion fades." "Or perhaps," Nathaniel replied, taking a step closer, "he has learned how to bury it." A flash of lightning lit the hall, carving both their silhouettes against the walls. The storm outside seemed to echo their silence. Finally, Mrs. Hale intervened softly. "Mr. Nathaniel, your father is in the study. He will wish to see you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I doubt that." But he turned and walked down the corridor, leaving a trail of rainwater across the marble floor. Later, long after the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle, Martha found herself drawn once again to the garden. She carried a small lantern, its light trembling with each gust of wind. The roses glistened under the rain, their petals bruised but unbroken. She needed air, space to think. Nathaniel's arrival had unsettled something inside her. His voice, his presence, even his disdain had shaken the fragile calm she had begun to build within these walls. A shadow moved near the arbor. He was there. Nathaniel stood under the stone archway, hands in his pockets, looking out toward the sea. The rain had darkened his hair, plastering it to his forehead. He turned when he heard her steps, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect anyone else to walk in the garden at this hour," he said quietly. "It's not the garden I came to see," she answered. "It's the sea. It helps me think." He regarded her for a moment, then said, almost to himself, "Clara used to say that." The name hung between them like an unspoken accusation. Martha's grip on the lantern tightened. "She loved this garden," Nathaniel continued. "She tended to every rose herself. My father hasn't set foot here since she died. I suppose that's why you've taken it upon yourself to restore it." Her voice trembled slightly. "I only wished to bring life back to what had been left behind." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "How noble. But tell me, Mrs. Lowell, do you believe you can revive what's already dead?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Not everything that sleeps is dead, Mr. Lowell. Some things are only waiting for care." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps recognition. He looked away first. "Do not mistake my words," he said finally. "I do not blame you for what has happened here. But you are living in a house built on ghosts, and whether you mean to or not, you are wearing another woman's shadow." Martha's throat tightened. "And you? Do you not also live in that shadow?" His eyes lifted to hers then, an unguarded moment, sharp and raw. "I left this house to escape it, but the past," he said, gesturing toward the cliffs, "has a way of following us home." They stood in silence, the rain softening to a mist. The lantern's flame fluttered between them, casting their faces in uneven light. His lined with resentment and something deeper, hers pale but resolute. When he finally turned to leave, he paused. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You don't look like someone who trades her freedom for a title." "And you," she replied softly, "don't look like someone who ran away without leaving a piece of himself behind." Their eyes met once more, and for a moment time seemed suspended between the falling drops of rain. Then he walked away, his figure fading into the mist toward the manor, leaving her alone with the roses, the sea, and the ghost of a woman whose presence still lingered in every breath of wind. Martha watched him go, her heart heavy with confusion and something dangerously close to empathy. The roses, glistening under the moonlight, trembled as the wind passed through them, as if they too remembered the name Clara Lowell and the love that had once been tended here. And for the first time since her wedding, Martha realized that Lowell Manor was not merely haunted by sorrow. It was alive with unfinished hearts, and she was now part of its silence. The first frost of the season traced delicate patterns across the windows of Lowell Manor, veiling the world beyond in soft opalescence. Inside, however, no such beauty tempered the chill. The silence between the walls had grown heavy, not from grief, but from something more volatile, the long-delayed collision of a father and son who had spent too many years avoiding each other's gaze. And now, into that strained corridor of old wounds and unspoken truths, Martha had been placed, not as a bridge, but as an unwilling witness. The dining room that evening was a stage of exquisite formality. The table, long and gleaming, had been set with crystal and silver polished to perfection. The chandelier overhead spilled golden light upon arrangements of autumnal branches and dried roses, symbols of fading beauty and memory. But the centerpiece was not the decor. It was the tension. Edwin, seated at the head of the table, held his fork with the same precision he applied to ledgers and treaties. His dark suit, tailored with immaculate care, seemed to stiffen his posture even further. His expression was impassive, but Martha had learned to read the minute signs, the furrow just above his brow, the way he chewed slower than usual, the slight tightening of his jaw. Across from him, Nathaniel sat with his arms casually resting on the sides of the chair, his cravat slightly loosened, his hair still damp from the garden walk he'd taken earlier. His presence was less rehearsed, more visceral, but the sharpness in his gaze was deliberate. He was not here to reconcile. He was here to unearth what had been buried beneath propriety. They had spoken little in her presence since his return, but tonight something had shifted. "I see the staff still serve dinner in the same order," Nathaniel remarked, his voice laced with cool irony. "Even after all these years, tradition remains your true heir, father." Edwin did not lift his eyes from his plate. "Some traditions are worth preserving, even the ones that led to silence." The pause was brief, but it thundered in Martha's chest. "I see you've not outgrown your flair for melodrama," Edwin replied, calmly cutting his meat. "Better than your flair for detachment," Nathaniel countered, his smile bitter. Martha set down her fork gently. "Perhaps this is not the moment." But Edwin raised a hand not to silence her, but to intercept the oncoming storm. "It is precisely the moment," he said. "Since you've returned uninvited, you may as well speak what you came to say." Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice lower now, tinged with something raw. "You sent for me?" "I did no such thing. I received a letter," Nathaniel said coldly, "bearing your seal, asking for my presence at the manor." A flicker passed through Edwin's expression. Surprise, perhaps. But he said nothing. Martha's pulse quickened. She looked between them, and in that fragile silence, she understood. Someone else had summoned Nathaniel, and neither man liked being played. Nathaniel's eyes turned to her then, sharp as broken glass. "Was it you?" She met his gaze. "No." "Convenient," he muttered. Her voice, when it rose again, was low but firm. "I do not summon men like hounds, Mr. Lowell, and I do not involve myself in things I do not understand." He studied her, searching for deceit. "And what is it you understand, Mrs. Lowell? The weight of your necklace, the size of your inheritance, or perhaps the cost of pretending to love a man twice your age?" The words struck like a slap, not for their vulgarity, but for their arrogance. Martha stood, slowly, with poise honed in silence, with dignity learned through sacrifice. Her voice did not tremble. "You presume much," she said, "for a man who abandoned his home and returned only to mock its ashes. I did not come to this house seeking affection, nor approval. I came because I was asked, and I stayed because I chose to endure. I wear no crown here. I serve no ambition, but my own peace." Nathaniel rose as well, almost involuntarily, as if something in her tone had lifted him from his seat. "And what is that peace worth to you?" he asked. She stepped closer, eyes unflinching. "More than the opinion of a man who does not know me, yet dares to judge me through the lens of his father's sins." The silence that followed was electric. Edwin, for the first time, looked not at his son, but at his wife, the woman he had taken for convenience, for duty, and for the first time he saw her, not as a symbol, but as a force. Nathaniel turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I apologize," he muttered after a long pause. "That was unjust." "It was," she said, without anger. They did not speak again during the meal. Later, in the drawing room, the fire crackled with gentle warmth, casting flickering shadows along the Persian rug. Martha sat near the hearth, her embroidery forgotten on her lap. Nathaniel entered quietly, no longer brash. The storm within him softened into thought. "I was wrong," he said, standing near the window. "You're not what I expected." She glanced up. "What did you expect?" "A puppet," he answered without hesitation. "A quiet, obedient woman, bought like the rest of this house." Martha folded her hands. "And now?" He turned. "Now I see someone who lives in the same prison my father built for himself, and perhaps for me." She met his eyes, and something shifted between them. Not attraction, not yet, but understanding. A recognition of pain mirrored, of burdens differently borne but similarly heavy. "You hate him," she said gently. "I did," Nathaniel admitted. For years, for choosing duty over feeling, for erasing her memory with silence, for sending me away when I questioned his grief. Martha lowered her gaze. He hasn't erased her. She lives in every closed room. Nathaniel sat in the chair across from her, his voice quiet now. And what do you live for, Mrs. Lowell? She paused. Then, with a breath, she answered, For a moment, when I may speak freely. When I am no longer a symbol or a possession or a quiet shadow in someone else's tale. A log popped in the fire, and Nathaniel leaned back, his gaze softening. You just did. And for a moment, there was peace. Not in resolution, but in shared exile. Two souls, cast aside by different cruelties, had found each other in a room of half-spoken truths. And though the storm had passed, its echo lingered in the walls of Lowell Manor, in the tension of glances, in the unspoken ache of the past. But from that night on, a fragile, uneasy respect took root between them, born not of affection, but of something rarer, a shared loneliness, finally seen. The wind that rattled the high windows of the manor that afternoon seemed to carry more than chill. It carried memory. It slipped beneath the doors and between the shutters, brushing along the gilded frames of oil paintings and across the brittle pages of old books. Martha had grown used to its presence, to its haunting voice in the halls, but on that particular day, it spoke differently, not like the whisper of the past, but like the breath before a revelation. She had not intended to return to the library. Not after the last time she stood before Clara's portrait and felt herself dissolving beneath its quiet gaze. But a mislaid book, a volume of poetry she had brought from the garden, sent her retracing her steps. And as she reached for it on the writing table, her sleeve brushed against the edge of the small lacquered cabinet near the hearth. It opened with the lightest pressure. She had seen it many times, but never thought it more than ornamental. Inside, she found an assortment of papers, some tied with ribbon, others stacked with more haste, receipts, telegrams, ledgers, and then, beneath them, she saw her father's handwriting. Her heart stilled. The letter was dated nearly a year before her wedding. She unfolded it slowly, as though afraid it might disintegrate in her hands. Lowell, I remind you of our agreement. The documentation is still in my possession, and my silence depends upon your cooperation. My daughter is of suitable age and education, and your name could benefit from the appearance of a virtuous alliance. Refuse, and I will proceed accordingly. A. Wentworth. She read the words once, then again, and again, until they blurred. The second letter was worse. Its tone was colder, its threats more specific. References to old dealings, to a scandal involving stock manipulation and a lawsuit quietly settled a decade ago. Her father had known, and he had used that knowledge to sell her like a bargaining chip to a man bound by duty and silence. Martha's fingers trembled as she returned the papers to the cabinet, but not before she took the letters, just those two, and tucked them into the sleeve of her dress. She walked from the library in silence, her skirts gliding against the marble floors like a ghost moving through its own tomb. In her sitting room, she laid the letters before her on the writing desk, staring at them with a strange detachment, as though they had been written about another woman entirely, and in some ways, perhaps they had. Because the woman who had stood at the altar, who had nodded through supper conversations and restored a rose garden, and accepted cold affection as her due, was not the woman who now read these lies. She waited until Edwin returned from his walk. The light was already fading when she heard the click of his boots on the stone steps, the murmur of the butler taking his coat. She did not wait for him to find her. She met him in the music room, where the fire had not yet been lit, and the silence between them echoed across the grand piano's polished surface. He turned when she entered, his brow lifting slightly. "Martha." She said nothing at first. She approached him with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in a single hour. When she stopped before him, she extended her hand. In it were the two letters. Edwin took them, his expression unreadable. He read in silence. When he finished, he folded the pages neatly and placed them on the edge of the mantel. "I see," he said. Her voice was low, controlled. "Is it true?" He looked at her then, not as he had at dinner or in the drawing room, but truly looked at her. And for a moment he said nothing. Then quietly he replied, "Yes." The world tilted. "You let me stand at that altar," she said, "believing it was my choice, believing you wanted peace, or perhaps decency. But it was a transaction. You married me to silence my father, to protect your reputation." Edwin's tone remained measured. "I married you because I had no other path. Your father's threats were real. He would have ruined everything I built. And what about me?" Her voice cracked, not with hysteria, but with grief. "What did you ruin in me, Edwin?" He closed his eyes briefly. "I never meant to hurt you." "That's the language of cowards," she said. She turned to go. "Martha," he called gently. She stopped, one hand on the doorframe, her back still to him. "When I agreed," he said, "I expected to resent you, to see in you only the price of silence. But I did not. You carried this house with more grace than I have in 10 years. You brought life back to what I abandoned. You are not what I deserved, but you became what I respected." The words were sincere, but they arrived too late, like roses blooming after a frost. She left the room without another word. That night she packed a small valise with only what she had brought from her father's house: the locket, the prayer book, a few worn gloves. She did not ask for a carriage. She walked. The sky was already dark when she arrived at her childhood home, the Wentworth house that had once gleamed with polished floors and laughter. Now it stood quiet, its windows dim, the wood along the porch chipped and dulled. She knocked. A servant answered and blinked in surprise. "Miss Martha, Mrs. Lowell," he corrected. "I wish to see my father." She was ushered in. The parlour smelled of old tobacco and damp wood. A fire sputtered weakly in the grate. Albert Wentworth entered a few minutes later, wearing a dressing gown and an expression of mild annoyance. "Martha," he said, "I didn't expect—" "No," she interrupted. "You didn't." He looked at her carefully, his eyes narrowing. "What happened?" She took the letters from her sleeve and placed them on the table between them. He recognized them instantly. "You read them?" "Yes." He made no effort to deny them, only sighed. "Well," he said, "I suppose it had to happen eventually. That's all you have to say?" "What else would you have me say?" he asked. "You're married, secure, your name restored, our debts cleared. I did what I had to do. You sold me. I saved us both." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved yourself." He poured a glass of brandy and took a slow sip. "You came all this way to accuse me then?" "I came because I have nowhere else to go." He looked at her long and hard. "You have a husband, a name, a house 10 times the size of this one. Go back to it. Uphold what we built. There is no place for you here, not anymore." She stood motionless, the fire casting flickering shadows across her face. "Even now," she whispered, "you would send me away." "You made your choice," he said. "No," she replied. "You made it for me. And now I live with the cost." She walked out into the cold without a cloak. The wind cut through her gown, and the tears she had fought so long began to fall, not in loud sobs, but in quiet, shuddering streams. The streets of Newport stretched before her, dim and unfamiliar. Every gas lamp flickered like a question. Every shadow seemed to echo the truth she could no longer escape. She had been given a house, a title, a seat at the table, but never a voice. And now, for the first time in her life, she walked with no name to protect her and no man to claim her, only her silence, only herself. The first whispers arrived like the chill before snowfall, quiet, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. At first they moved behind fans in gilded salons, in the hush between one waltz and another. Then they grew louder, slipping into parlours with silver trays and whispered confidences, and finally they thundered onto the printed page. It began with an anonymous column, in the Newport Herald, delicately titled Matters of Matrimony and Misconduct. The writer made no direct accusations, but the implications were as sharp as glass. It is a curious arrangement indeed, when a widow of barely 2 months can be seen alone in a private garden with the very man who once bore the name she now carries. When such companionship continues after the father's illness, questions bloom like roses in autumn, unexpected and difficult to ignore. By the next day, Martha Lowell's name was on every tongue from Bellevue Avenue to the harbour, but it was not spoken with admiration. It was murmured in caution, lifted with sly curiosity, rolled on lips heavy with judgment. She learned of the article from Mrs. Hale, whose eyes filled with quiet dread as she handed Martha the folded paper, still warm from the press. Martha read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it on the silver tray before her. She did not cry, not even when the second article followed, more daring in tone, suggesting that the young bride's loyalty may have shifted too quickly from ailing husband to grieving son. It was never explicit. That was the genius of it. It only asked questions, planted seeds, and Newport society, hungry for scandal, starved of true nobility, nurtured those seeds with relish. Servants began whispering in corners. Invitations stopped arriving. Even the florist at the corner of Catherine Street, who had once offered her roses with a bow, now avoided her eyes. But what stung more than the humiliation was the silence inside the manor. Edwin said nothing. He remained in his study, pale and weary, reading the papers with tired eyes. He did not confront her nor offer comfort, only retreated deeper into the house, as though distance might dissolve disgrace. Nathaniel, however, did not hide. He burst into the morning room 3 days after the first article, his boots wet with mud, the newspaper crushed in his gloved fist. His eyes burned. "Enough," he said, his voice tight with fury. "This is cowardice." Martha, seated by the fire with her embroidery untouched, looked up calmly. "You've read it, then?" "I've read it. I've heard it. I've listened to it shouted across cigar smoke and whispered beneath lace veils. And all of it, every word, is venom." She did not speak. Her fingers rested lightly on the hoop of the embroidery, unmoving. Nathaniel came closer. "You don't deserve this. None of it. They will say what they wish," she murmured. "They always do." He knelt beside her chair, not in affection, but in urgency. "Then let me say something in return, publicly. Let me write to the Herald. Let me stand in the same drawing rooms and tell them the truth. You have done nothing to warrant shame." Her voice softened. "And what would you say, Nathaniel? That I am your father's wife and not your lover? That I walk the garden not for pleasure but to breathe? They do not care. They do not want the truth. They want a scandal they can sip with tea." "I'll give them a scandal then," he snapped, standing. "I'll give them the sight of a Lowell defending honor, not his own, but a woman's." "No," she rose, facing him. "You would burn your name to save mine." "I would," he said, and she believed him. That afternoon, Nathaniel walked into the Reading Society of Newport, where ladies and gentlemen lingered over the day's periodicals and engaged in what passed for intellectual debate. With steady hands and a steady voice, he requested that the next edition of the Herald publish his open letter, signed, dated and phrased with the clarity of a barrister and the conviction of a man who no longer feared scandal. "Let it be known that my father's wife, Mrs. Martha Lowell, has borne the weight of this house with dignity beyond what the public deserves to witness. Those who speak ill of her speak not of truth, but of cowardice dressed in silk. And if you must assign sin, assign it to me, who walked in the garden beside her and found not seduction but serenity." The letter made headlines. It did not clear her name, but it silenced the vultures. Martha read it the next morning in her sitting room. She did not weep, but she touched the page with her fingertips as if it were a wound she had not expected to be seen, much less defended. That evening, Edwin did not come to supper. Instead, Mrs. Hale knocked gently at Martha's door with news that the doctor had been summoned. She went to the study without hesitation. Edwin sat in his armchair by the fire, a shawl draped over his shoulders, his skin pale and his hands trembling slightly. The doctor stood nearby, quietly collecting his instruments, his expression somber. "What is it?" Martha asked. The physician hesitated. "Fatigue, nervous strain, perhaps the heart. He needs rest. No more newspapers, no more correspondence, no more arguments." Martha turned to Edwin. His eyes were dull with exhaustion, but his lips curved faintly. "So I am now forbidden to live," he said dryly. The doctor offered a polite smile, bowed, and took his leave. When they were alone, Martha knelt beside her husband's chair, placing a hand gently on his. "You should have told me," she said softly, "about your health." "And burden you further?" he murmured. "No, Martha, I have done enough." She looked into his face and saw something she had not seen before. Not grief, not pride, not even guilt, but fear. The kind of fear that creeps in when a man realizes the empire he built cannot hold his name when his voice is gone. "I never wished to ruin you," he said after a long silence. "You did not ruin me," she whispered. "You only taught me how to survive." His hand tightened slightly around hers. The fire crackled. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, painting the manor's windows with a soft white light. Martha stood and walked to the hearth, her silhouette framed by fire and snow. She had been many things since arriving at Lowell Manor: bride, stranger, scapegoat. But in that moment, she felt none of those identities cling to her. She felt only the weight of her own name. She turned back to Edwin. "I will stay," she said. "Not because I am your wife, but because I choose to." His eyes glistened, and for the first time he bowed his head, not in defeat but in something closer to gratitude. Later that night, Martha walked alone through the house. She passed the closed doors, the portraits, the grand staircase, and the library, where her father's lies still lingered in paper and ink. She did not open a single door. She only walked, silently, steadily, a woman no longer waiting to be defined, but quietly deciding who she would become now that the world had turned its gaze upon her and seen her standing tall. And somewhere, in the garden, beneath the frost, the roses endured, waiting for spring. The light that entered Lowell Manor that morning was pale and uncertain, filtered through heavy clouds that seemed reluctant to lift. The fireplaces had been lit in every room, but still the house felt cold, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Martha moved quietly through the corridors, her gown whispering along the floor, the weight of her days etched in the tilt of her shoulders. She had grown used to the silence in the manor, but that morning it felt different, heavier, like something unspoken was pressing against every door. In the dining room, the table was laid but untouched. The silver gleamed dully in the half-light, and the scent of burned coffee lingered in the air. The butler hovered nearby, hesitant to speak, but Martha did not ask for explanations. She had long learned that in this house, truth arrived in silence before it ever arrived in words. She found Edwin and Nathaniel in the study. The moment she opened the door, she felt it. The room was thick with tension, the kind that had been brewing beneath the surface for too long. Edwin sat in his armchair, wrapped in a thick wool robe, his complexion sallow, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. Nathaniel stood near the window, his back stiff, one hand clenched at his side. "You had no right," Edwin said, his voice rough but steady. "No right to speak on my behalf." Nathaniel turned. "I didn't speak for you. I spoke for her, because you wouldn't. I protected her the only way I knew how," Edwin snapped. You used her," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising. "You let the world believe she was something she's not, and now you resent me for saying aloud what you were too afraid to admit." Martha stepped further into the room. "Stop," she said quietly, but neither man heard her. "You think you know everything. Edwin said, struggling to rise from the chair. You come back after all these years and pretend to care. But where were you when... His voice broke off. He took a step, then staggered. Father? Nathaniel's voice shifted instantly, from rage to fear. Edwin's knees buckled. Martha was at his side in an instant, catching his weight as best she could. He was heavier than he looked and suddenly limp, like something had given way within him. Help me, she said, and together they eased him back into the chair. His face was ashen. A fine sheen of sweat broke along his brow, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Send for the doctor, Martha whispered. Nathaniel bolted from the room. Edwin's hand grasped hers, frail now, trembling. She had never seen him so diminished, not even in his most distant moments, and yet in that weakness, something in his expression softened. I knew, he said, voice barely audible, from the first moment that you deserved better. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. Don't speak. Save your strength. But he continued, his breath shallow. I thought, if I made you my wife, perhaps I could pretend to be the man I once wanted to be. Edwin, she said gently, her hand covering his, you don't need to pretend. You are enough. No, he murmured. Not enough. Not for you. Not for the son I pushed away. I thought I was punishing your father when I agreed to the marriage, but I was punishing myself. She blinked, the ache in her chest spreading like fire. He looked at her then, eyes clearer than she had seen in weeks. I loved you, he said, a fragile smile ghosting across his lips. Not like a young man loves, but with respect, with hope. You gave me back the smallest piece of who I used to be. She could not speak. Her throat was too tight. His hand trembled as it reached for something on the side table. A leather-bound folder. My will, he said. It's all in there. Your dowry is yours, untouched. But more than that, you are free. No obligations, no debt to carry. You walk away from this with your name, your dignity, and my blessing. Martha shook her head, tears falling now. Why are you saying goodbye? Because I know, he whispered. It's close. I can feel it. Don't, she breathed. He smiled faintly. There's nothing to fear. I've feared too long. And you were the only good thing I gave the world. His eyes fluttered shut. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead gently to his. I forgive you, she whispered. And I thank you. His breathing slowed, then stopped. Martha sat there, holding his hand long after the warmth faded. She did not call for anyone. Not yet. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the windowsills with a quiet grace. When she finally rose, she took the folder with her. Not as a widow bound by duty, but as a woman, finally and undeniably free. Winter laid its quiet claim over Newport, veiling its cliffs and rooftops in a soft, pale hush. The town, once brimming with whispers and watchful glances, had grown still. In that stillness, Martha Lowell found something she had never truly known. Silence that was not absence, but peace. The manor overlooking the sea remained hers. Its stone walls had not crumbled, nor had its grand windows dimmed. But within, its atmosphere had shifted. The curtains no longer cloaked the sun. The doors no longer echoed with hesitation, and the rose garden, now bare and sleeping beneath frost, waited, like her, for spring. 3 months had passed since Edwin's final breath, since his fingers curled around hers and whispered words etched themselves into her soul. The weight of grief had not vanished. It had simply transformed, less a shroud, more a shadow that followed without overtaking. Martha walked each morning along the cliff path, where the sea rolled below in endless rhythm. She wore her mourning attire with dignified simplicity, a long coat of black velvet, a thin veil that no longer covered her face. Townsfolk, once wary or unkind, now tipped their hats in solemn acknowledgement. Even the same florist who once looked away now offered her violets when she passed his shop. She had become, without meaning to, a figure of quiet reverence. A woman who had survived disgrace, loss, and isolation, yet never descended into bitterness. On the first Monday of February, the butler handed her a letter with her tea. It bore no seal, only her name, written in a firm, familiar hand. Edwin's. She sat by the tall window in her sitting room, where snow fell gently beyond the glass, and opened the envelope with hands that did not tremble. "My dear Martha, if you are reading this, I have left this world. I wish I could say that thought pains me more than it does. But the truth is, I made peace with my mortality long ago. What I never made peace with, until you, was the life I led before you came into it. You were never meant to be a punishment, though I fear I made you carry that weight. In truth, you were a mirror I was too proud to look into. You saw me clearly, and still, you did not flinch. You gave this house back its dignity. You gave my son back his purpose, and in some quiet, miraculous way, you gave me back my soul. Do not grieve me long. I was not your love, but I hope I became your friend. That is more than I ever expected to be to anyone again. Live, Martha. Don't linger in shadows. Let the world see you, as I came to see you, not as a name or a wife or a figure to be feared, but as a woman of astonishing grace. I leave you with everything that was mine, not because it is owed, but because I can give you nothing else that equals what you gave me. Yours in quiet gratitude, Edwin." She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, eyes closed. No tears came, only a deep, shattering stillness that filled her with something she could not name. That afternoon, she walked the cliffs again. The sky was heavy with cloud, but no snow fell. Only the wind moved, carrying the scent of the sea and something else, something familiar. At the edge of the path, near the windswept bench where she sometimes paused to read or think, stood a figure. Nathaniel. He did not turn when she approached. He was dressed in a simple dark coat, scarf tucked neatly around his neck, hands in his pockets. His hair had grown slightly longer, brushed back by the salt wind. "I didn't write," he said, his voice low but steady. "I thought perhaps you wouldn't wish to see me." "I thought you might come," she replied. He turned then, and their eyes met. No bitterness lived in his gaze now, only something quieter, earnest, changed. "I've been in Boston," he said, "settling what was left of the firm, putting things in order." She nodded. "And your father's letter to the trust? Did it go through?" "It did. Your name remains on everything, as it should." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging lightly at their coats. Below, the sea broke against the cliffs with patient, endless rhythm. "I came to thank you," he said at last. "For what?" "For staying," he replied. "For giving him peace. For giving me something I hadn't realized I needed." "And what was that?" "A reason to forgive," he said simply. "Him and myself." Martha looked out toward the horizon. The waves stretched to infinity, each one folding into the next like time swallowing itself. "I found his letter," she said, "this morning. Did it help?" She gave a soft smile. "It helped me say goodbye." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "And are you ready to say hello again?" She turned slowly to him, searching his face. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "I only know I don't wish to walk through it alone." Nathaniel extended his arm, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just enough for her to take should she choose to. She didn't hesitate. Her hand slid into the crook of his arm, warm and steady. They walked, not quickly, not slowly, not as lovers or as promises, but as two people who had weathered the same storm from opposite sides and now stepped together into what remained. The townspeople saw them as they passed, together, yet unspoken. Some whispered, some nodded, some said nothing at all. It didn't matter. By the time they reached the final bend of the path, the wind had softened. A shaft of light broke through the clouds, casting golden warmth across the frozen garden below. And still, they walked. One step, then another, not toward certainty, but towards something real. Spring returned to Lowell Manor not with trumpets or triumph, but with the quiet confidence of things that have survived. Beneath the lingering chill of April mornings, the ground softened. Buds dared to unfold. The wind, once bitter, carried the scent of new earth and promise. And in the heart of the estate, the rose garden, long dormant beneath snow and silence, bloomed again. The petals were not perfect. Some bore scars from winter's grip, others opened late, hesitant, but together they formed a tapestry of color and resilience, a reflection of the woman who now walked among them with gloved hands and steady breath. Martha had not opened the gates of the garden to society for praise. She had done so because something within her needed to give life back to what was once abandoned, just as she had once been. She walked the paths daily, pruning where needed, guiding where growth had returned wild. She remembered which roses Clara Lowell had planted, and which she herself had coaxed back to bloom. That morning, the garden was filled with quiet voices, as women from the Newport Charitable Society gathered beneath silk parasols and feathered hats, each admiring the revival as if it were a miracle. "This was once so overgrown," one remarked. "We thought it would never return." Martha, dressed in a dove-grey gown trimmed with lilac ribbon, accepted their compliments with gracious nods. But her eyes wandered beyond the visitors, toward the bench beneath the old arbor, where vines now twisted with tender green, and where Nathaniel waited, leaning slightly forward, elbows on his knees, watching her with the quiet reverence of a man who understood the weight of becoming. It had been weeks since their walk along the cliffs, and though they had not spoken often, they had not needed to. Their silences had grown companionable, their glances had become conversations. After the last guests departed, and the garden stood still again, Martha removed her gloves and walked slowly to the arbor. Nathaniel rose as she approached, and when she reached him, he did not sit again until she did. She folded her hands in her lap. The air smelled of roses and sun-warmed stone. The wind stirred the hem of her gown and caught loose strands of her hair, brushing them across her cheek. Nathaniel reached out, just barely, and tucked one behind her ear, the touch so gentle it barely existed, yet charged with something unspoken. He did not speak immediately. He rarely did. But when he did, his words held weight. "You've done more than restore this garden," he said softly. "You've changed how the town speaks, how it sees you, how it sees us," she corrected gently. He tilted his head. "You don't owe me that." "I know," she replied. Silence settled again, not uncomfortable but full, like a letter waiting to be opened. "I've thought," he began slowly, "about leaving Newport." Her heart thudded once, sharp and clear. He went on, "Not because I'm running. I've done enough of that. But because I wonder what else might exist beyond this place, beyond this name, beyond the weight of what we inherited." She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting lightly. "And what would you seek?" He answered without hesitation. "Something honest, something of my own making." Then more softly, "Something that doesn't begin with shadows." Martha looked at him fully now, her gaze steady. "And do you believe I belong in that something?" "I don't know," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I would like to find out." He stood, turning to face her completely. The wind lifted the tails of his coat and carried with it the scent of new roses and old earth. "I have no promises," he said, "only this question." He extended his hand. "Shall we walk this path together?" For a long moment, she did not move. She looked at his hand, the same one that had once clenched in rage, then softened in understanding. A hand that now trembled, just slightly, with vulnerability. And then she rose. Her fingers slid into his. They did not kiss. There were no tears. Only the sound of two pairs of footsteps moving together along the gravel path. Past the roses, past the gates, past what had once held them still. She was no longer the girl who had stood at the altar in silence, nor the wife cloaked in sacrifice. She was a woman shaped by sorrow, defined by dignity, and finally free to choose. And she chose not a future written in stone, but a journey walked beside someone who had also chosen her. They left the garden as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the blooms, but their steps were light. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead held only what they were willing to build, together. The rose garden bloomed earlier that year. It had been a gentle spring, less rain, more light, and the blossoms had stretched open as if called by memory itself. Along the gravel paths of Lowell Manor, now softened by time and laughter, the roses breathed in the morning sun, their petals unfolding in a spectrum of faded crimson, ivory, and soft peach. In the center of the garden, beneath the same wrought-iron arbor that once bore silence and longing, Martha sat with her gloved hands resting on her lap and a book unopened beside her. The years had touched her gently. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, now carried the first strands of silver like ribbons of dignity. Lines had appeared around her eyes, not from sorrow, but from smiling too often in the sun. She looked up as the wind carried the sound of hurried steps, bare feet on stone, a girl's laugh, the echo of breathless joy. "Be careful with the lavender, sweet one," Martha called out. "Your papa just replanted them." A small voice, light and mischievous, called back, "I'm not touching them, only smelling." From behind a trellis emerged a little girl of 8, her curls flying, her cheeks flushed with the color of youth. She held a single rose in her hand, freshly picked, and wore a crown of daisies someone had woven that morning. Martha smiled. 12 years had passed since Edwin's death, since Nathaniel had offered no promises, only a question. And in those 12 years, life had become something beautiful in its simplicity. No grand declarations, no titles on social pages, just shared mornings, restored rooms, letters sent and received, 2 children born in quiet joy. Their daughter Clara Rose, named for the woman whose memory once haunted the manor and the flower that changed everything, had inherited her father's fierce heart and her mother's quiet grace. Their son, James, now 10, had his grandfather Edwin's contemplative brow and a mind filled with maps and invention. He spent most afternoons with books and a telescope, claiming he would one day build a machine to touch the sky. Nathaniel arrived at the edge of the garden, now dressed in shirt sleeves and suspenders, a basket of tools in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked older, yes, but stronger, more at peace. The lines that time had drawn upon him only deepened the steadiness in his eyes. "She's decapitated your prize rose again," Martha teased gently, watching him shake his head with mock despair. "I'll survive," he said, "as long as she doesn't try pruning the apple trees." He walked to Martha and pressed a kiss to her temple, the kind of kiss one gives when words are too small for gratitude. Then he knelt beside their daughter and accepted the rose she offered as if it were a crown. Their world had changed. Not quickly, not loudly, but undeniably. After Edwin's death, the town had watched, as it always did. But scandal had given way to admiration. Martha's strength, Nathaniel's devotion, and the dignity with which they rebuilt what others had tried to tear down. All of it softened Newport's judgments. People began to ask her to speak at charitable events. Young women sought her advice. Her name, once whispered in disdain, had become a standard of quiet resilience. Not everyone survived the turning tide. Albert Wentworth, her father, had died 5 years prior, alone in a rented apartment in Boston, estranged from most of society. He never wrote, never asked forgiveness. Martha mourned him not for the man he had been, but for the father he never chose to become. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper who had once placed gloves by her door without a word, now lived in the East Wing, retired and content, often found telling stories to Clara and James in the kitchen, surrounded by flour and the smell of cinnamon. The manor itself, once a house of echoes, had transformed. Music was heard in its halls. Its doors remained open to friends, travellers, and booksellers. The rose garden became a place not of memory alone, but of gathering, weddings, teas, readings of poetry. A garden that once mourned, now bloomed with purpose. Martha stood and looked out toward the sea. 12 years, and not once had she regretted choosing to stay. She had learned in those years that love did not always roar, that some loves whispered through daily kindnesses, through shared burdens, through hands held in silence when grief returned unexpected. She and Nathaniel had not chased grand passion. They had built a home, a family, a life. And that, she realized, was the greatest romance of all. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, their shoulders brushing. "She's asking if she can name the new rose," he said. Martha smiled. "And what does she want to call it?" "Courage." She blinked, surprised, then nodded slowly. "That's a fine name." They stood together in the sun, watching their daughter run among the roses and their son emerge from the orchard with a book tucked under his arm. And as the wind danced through the garden, Martha reached for Nathaniel's hand, not because she needed support, but because she had chosen him once and would choose him again, always. Sometimes the most powerful love stories are not built on grand gestures, but on quiet strength, second chances, and the courage to choose again, after sorrow, after scandal, after silence. Martha's journey reminds us that dignity is not given by society, but forged in the fire of adversity. That love, true love, is not always born of passion, but of patience, honesty, and mutual respect. And that healing often begins the moment we dare to believe we are worthy of more. If this story moved you, even just a little, I invite you to leave the word courage in the comments. It's a simple way to show you made it to the end, and to help others discover this emotional journey too. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves timeless romance, deep emotion, and stories that linger in the heart long after they end. And if you're craving more tales like this one, make sure to check the suggestions I've left for you in the cards above. Thank you for listening. May you always find the strength to rewrite your own story with hope, with grace, and with courage.